I never thought my own son would erase me from his life like deleting a phone number. The morning I discovered Theo had blocked me, I was watering the African violets on my kitchen windowsill, the same ones I'd tended for 30 years through his scraped knees and broken hearts. 48 years of motherhood, countless bedtime stories, and a lifetime of unconditional love. All of it suddenly meant nothing. He needs space to build his marriage. His voicemail had said 3 weeks, earlier before the silence began. But what kind of space requires complete erasure? Before I tell you what I did next, tell me where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The house felt too quiet that Tuesday morning in October. I sat at my kitchen table, the phone still warm in my palm, from trying Theo's number for the 5th time that week. Each attempt met the same cruel efficiency. Straight to voicemail, no ring, no chance. Just the mechanical voice telling me the FAUB. Subscriber was unavailable. My name is Eloise Hartley, and at 72, I've learned that some wounds cut deeper than others. Losing my husband Robert when Theo was barely 2 had been devastating, but it was a loss I could understand. Cancer doesn't discriminate, and grief, however brutal, follows a recognizable pattern. This was different. This was my own child choosing to make me disappear. The kitchen around me held 40 years of memories. Robert's coffee mug still sat in the cabinet, though I hadn't used it since he died. Theo's childhood artwork remained magnetized to the refrigerator. Faded finger paintings of our family, all stick figures and bright smiles. The pencil marks on the doorframe still tracked his growth from age 4 to 18, each inch a celebration we'd shared together. I'd been the town librarian for 35 years before retiring, and my house reflected that same careful organization. Books lined every wall, sorted by subject and author. Photo albums filled 2 entire shelves, each one meticulously labeled by year. I was the mother who kept everything. Every report card, every crayon drawing, every program from his school, plays. Cassandra probably saw it as hoarding. I saw it as love made tangible. The wedding had been beautiful. I'll give her that. Cassandra had impeccable taste. White roses, string quartet, reception at the country club. She'd worn her grandmother's pearls and a dress that cost more than I spent on groceries in 6 months. I'd watched my son's face as she walked down the aisle. Saw the wonder there, the hope. For a moment, I'd felt only happiness for them. But even during the reception, I'd sensed something shifting. Cassandra's parents, distinguished, wealthy, emotionally distant, had made polite conversation with me. The kind of careful courtesy reserved for people you're obligated to acknowledge but don't particularly want to know. They spoke in measured tones about their winter home in Florida and their son's medical practice in Boston, as if ordinary lives were somehow insufficient by comparison. Theo had been different that day, too. More formal somehow. When I'd hugged him after the ceremony, he'd felt stiff in my arms, like a stranger practicing proper etiquette. "Thank you for everything, Mom," he'd said, and something in his tone suggested an ending rather than a beginning. I understood that. Marriages required adjustment. When Robert and I had wed, I'd had to learn to share him with his work, his friends, his dreams that didn't always include me. But this felt different, not like growth, but like amputation. My sister Inez called it growing pains. But Inez had always been more practical about relationships than I was. She'd divorced twice and maintained casual friendships with both ex-husbands, somehow managing to compartmentalize affection in ways I'd never mastered. "He's establishing boundaries," she'd say over our weekly phone calls. It's healthy. But what boundaries required complete silence? What healthy marriage demanded the surgical removal of a mother's love? I'd raised Theo alone from age 2 to 22, and we'd been a team. When he'd had nightmares about monsters under his bed, I'd invented elaborate stories about brave knights who befriended dragons. When he'd struggled with algebra in 8th grade, we'd spent entire weekends at this same kitchen table, working through problems until the concepts clicked. When he'd been rejected by his first-choice college, I'd held him while he cried, then helped him craft applications to schools that would recognize his worth. We'd talked every Sunday for the past 8 years since he'd moved to Boston for his law career. He'd call while making breakfast, and I'd sit here with my coffee, listening to stories about his cases, his colleagues, his dating adventures that eventually led to Cassandra. Those conversations had been the bright spots of my weeks, proof that despite the physical distance, we remained connected. Now the phone sat silent, and I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. I tried to remember when things had started changing. Certainly the frequency of our calls had decreased after he'd begun dating Cassandra seriously. What had once been weekly conversations became bi-weekly, then monthly. When I'd asked about her, his responses had grown increasingly vague. She's wonderful, Mom. Really driven. You'll love her when you meet her. But when I had met her, 6 months before the wedding, I'd sensed immediately that love wasn't on the table. Cassandra had been perfectly polite, complimented my home and my cooking, asked appropriate questions about my work at the library, but there'd been something calculating in her gaze, as if she were conducting an assessment rather than getting to know her future mother-in-law. She'd looked at the photo albums with the kind of smile people reserve for museum exhibits. Interested, but detached, observing someone else's history, rather than joining a family narrative. When I'd shown her pictures of Theo as a child, she'd said, "How sweet," in the same tone she might use to admire a stranger's pet. Later I'd overheard her, on the phone in the guest room, talking to someone about the situation with Theo's mother. The words had been too muffled to understand completely, but the tone had been clear enough. I was a problem to be managed, not a person to be welcomed. Still, I'd convinced myself that time would soften her edges, that she'd grow to appreciate the love Theo and I shared rather than seeing it as competition. I'd been wrong. The last real conversation I'd had with my son had been 3 weeks after the wedding. He'd called on a Thursday evening, his voice tight with stress I couldn't identify. "Mom, Cassandra and I have been talking, and we think it would be good for us to have some space while we're adjusting to married life." Space. Such a clinical word for what felt like abandonment. "What kind of space?" I'd asked. Though part of me already knew. Just time to figure out our rhythm as a couple. We'll reach out when we're ready. "Theo, honey, I don't understand. Have I done something wrong?" The pause that followed had lasted long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded strained, almost rehearsed. "It's not about wrong or right, Mom. It's about what's healthy for our marriage." That word again. Healthy. As if our relationship had been diseased. As if the love I'd poured into raising him had somehow contaminated his ability to love someone else. I'd wanted to argue, to demand explanations, to insist on my right to remain part of his life. Instead, I'd said, "I understand," because I'd been trained by decades of motherhood to put his needs above my own pain. That had been our last conversation. 3 weeks of silence that felt like 3 years. Now I sat in my too-quiet kitchen, surrounded by evidence of a life spent loving him, and wondered if I'd somehow loved wrong. Had I been too attentive, too involved, too present? Had I raised him to be incapable of independence, Or had I simply raised him so well that he no longer needed me? The afternoon light slanted through my windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like memories. Soon it would be Halloween, Theo's favorite holiday as a child. I still had his costume from when he was 7, a vampire cape he'd worn 3 years running because he'd loved the way it made him feel powerful. I wondered if Cassandra knew about that cape, about the way he'd practiced his scary laugh in the mirror, about how he'd insisted on keeping the cape under his pillow for weeks after Halloween because it made him feel safe. I wondered if she knew any of the real Theo at all. The revelation came through the most ordinary of circumstances. I was grocery shopping at Miller's Market on a Thursday afternoon, reaching for apples in the produce section, when I heard her voice. Cassandra was talking to someone on her phone, standing near the organic vegetables with her back to me, her tone crisp and confident. "No, Mom, you don't understand. She's exactly the kind of mother-in-law everyone warns you about. Theo's finally seeing it too." I froze, my hand suspended over a Honeycrisp apple, suddenly understanding what it meant, to be invisible in plain sight. She kept photo albums of his entire childhood, like everything, every tooth he lost, every birthday party, every school event. It's obsessive. And the way she talks about him. Cassandra's voice dropped slightly, but I could still hear every word. She calls him her baby boy in front of people, at 47 years old. It's embarrassing. My throat constricted. I'd said that exactly once, at their engagement party when someone had asked how I felt about Theo getting married. "I'm so proud of my baby boy," I'd said, the words slipping out naturally, the way they had for decades. I hadn't realized how it sounded to someone who didn't understand that some phrases are carved into a mother's heart, beyond conscious editing. "The emotional manipulation is the worst part," Cassandra continued, now examining tomatoes with the same critical attention she was giving my character. "She guilt-trips him constantly. I raised you alone, and I sacrificed everything for you, and I just want what's best for you. Classic narcissistic mother behavior. Narcissistic." The word hit like a physical blow. I'd spent my career helping children find books that would open their worlds. Had volunteered at the literacy center every Saturday for 15 years. Had quietly supported 3 single mothers in our neighborhood by babysitting their children for free. The idea that my love for my son could be reduced to a clinical diagnosis felt like being erased in the cruelest possible way. "Theo's been in therapy for 2 months now, working through all of it," she said, moving toward the checkout. "Dr. Morrison says it's textbook enmeshment. She never let him develop proper boundaries." I stood there holding an apple I no longer wanted, watching my son's wife pay for her groceries while discussing my psychological profile with someone who'd probably never met me. The cashier, Jenny Martinez, whose daughter I'd helped with reading comprehension every Tuesday last year, smiled at Cassandra with the warm recognition reserved for regular customers. "Have a wonderful day, Mrs. Hartley," Jenny said, and the name that had been mine for 45 years sounded foreign on her lips when applied to someone else. Cassandra thanked her politely and walked out, still talking on her phone about establishing healthy boundaries and breaking generational patterns. I stood in the produce section until my hands started shaking, then quietly put the apple back and walked to my car without buying anything. The drive home passed in a blur of autumn colors that seemed suddenly muted. I'd driven these same roads for decades, but everything felt different now, like viewing familiar scenery through dirty glass. The white colonial where the Hendersons had raised 4 children looked smaller somehow. The oak tree where Theo had fallen and broken his arm at age 9 seemed less substantial, more ordinary. My house, when I pulled into the driveway, looked exactly like what Cassandra had probably described to her mother. The home of an elderly woman living too much in the past. The garden I'd tended for 40 years needed weeding. The shutters could use fresh paint. The front steps where Theo had learned to tie his shoes were weathered and worn. Inside, I walked through rooms that suddenly felt like evidence against me. The living room mantel displayed school photos spanning kindergarten through law school. Graduation. What I'd seen as celebration, Cassandra saw as obsession. The bookshelf in the hallway held every birthday card Theo had ever made me. Construction paper creations with crayon hearts and careful lettering that said, "I love you, Mummy." What I'd treasured as precious memories, she'd classify as inability to let go. In the kitchen, I sat at the table where Theo and I had shared thousands of meals and conversations, and tried to see myself through Cassandra's eyes. Was I emotionally manipulative? Had I really said, "I sacrificed everything for you," in a way that made him feel guilty rather than loved? When I'd mentioned missing him during our phone calls, had I been sharing natural maternal feelings or laying groundwork for psychological control? The silence in the house felt different now. Not just empty, but accusatory. Every photo on the refrigerator, every saved piece of artwork, every carefully preserved memento of his childhood suddenly seemed like evidence of my failure to understand healthy relationships. I thought about Dr. Morrison, whoever he was, helping my son work through our relationship like it was trauma rather than love. I wondered what stories Theo was telling, what memories he was reframing, what moments of tenderness he was now classifying as emotional manipulation. Had I really guilt-tripped him? I searched my memory for conversations that might have crossed, invisible lines I hadn't known existed. When he'd moved to Boston, and I'd said, "The house feels so quiet without you." Had that been sharing my feelings or making him responsible for my happiness? When I told him I was proud of the man he'd become, had I somehow implied ownership of his achievements? The phone rang around 5 o'clock, jolting me from my spiral of self-examination. Inez's name appeared on the caller ID, and I almost didn't answer. I wasn't ready to hear practical advice about giving Theo space or accepting new family dynamics. "You sound terrible," she said immediately when I picked up. "What's wrong?" I told her about the grocery store, about overhearing Cassandra's conversation, about learning that my son was in therapy specifically to address his relationship with me. Inez listened without interrupting, a skill she'd developed during her years as a social worker. "Eloise," she said finally, "you know that's not who you are." "But what if it is?" The words came out smaller than I'd intended. What if I was so focused on being a good mother that I forgot to teach him how to have other relationships? What if I damaged him without realizing it? "Honey, I watched you raise that boy. You were devoted, not obsessive. You were present, not controlling. There's a difference, even if some people can't see it. Cassandra sees manipulation where I see love. Cassandra sees competition where she should see collaboration. That's her limitation, not yours." But even Inez's reassurance couldn't quiet the questions that had taken root. I spent the evening going through photo albums, looking for evidence of the unhealthy relationship Cassandra had described. Instead, I saw a single mother and her son building a life together. Birthday parties and bedtime stories, soccer games and science projects, college visits and graduation celebrations. I saw love. But apparently, love could be misinterpreted, weaponized, used as evidence against the person who'd offered it most freely. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about boundaries I'd supposedly never established, and space I'd allegedly never provided. I thought about Theo sitting in Dr. Morrison's office, dissecting our relationship like specimens under a microscope, learning to pathologize the very foundation of his childhood. Somewhere across town, in the apartment they shared, Cassandra was probably congratulating herself on helping her husband break free from his emotionally manipulative mother. She was probably proud of encouraging him to seek therapy, proud of helping him establish healthy boundaries, proud of protecting their marriage from my allegedly toxic influence. And Theo, my baby boy, though I'd never call him that again, was probably sleeping peacefully next to his wife, convinced that cutting me out of his life was an act of psychological health rather than heartbreaking cruelty. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine what healthy looked like in their definition. Apparently, it meant a mother who existed only in carefully managed doses, who shared her child with perfect emotional detachment, who celebrated milestones from a respectful distance without ever expressing how much those milestones meant to her. It meant loving less visibly, less completely, less honestly than I'd ever known how to love. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt truly alone. Not just physically isolated, but fundamentally misunderstood. The love that had defined my life for 47 years had been reclassified as pathology, and I didn't know how to defend something so essential to who I was. But lying there in the darkness, surrounded by the quiet accusation of my too sentimental house, I began to feel something else stirring beneath the hurt and confusion. Not anger, exactly, but something harder and more determined. If Cassandra wanted to understand the full scope of my obsessive documentation, if she thought she knew the real story of Theo's childhood, then perhaps it was time to give her the complete picture. Perhaps it was time to show her exactly what 47 years of emotional manipulation actually looked like. The next morning, I woke with an unusual sense of purpose. For the first time in weeks, I had a plan, though I wasn't entirely sure what it would accomplish. I made coffee, fed the violets, and sat down at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen. If Cassandra believed I was an obsessive documentarian, then I would document. If she thought my record-keeping was evidence of unhealthy attachment, then I would provide her with the most comprehensive record possible. I would write down everything, not the sanitized versions suitable for Christmas cards, but the real, unvarnished truth of what it meant to raise Theodore Robert Hartley. From a grieving toddler to a successful man, I started with the obvious place, the photo albums. But instead of just looking at pictures, I began writing the stories behind them. Not just Theo's first day of kindergarten, but the whole truth. How he'd cried for 20 minutes that morning because he was afraid I wouldn't be there when school ended. How I'd promised to wait by the flagpole. How he'd made me pinky swear 3 times before he'd let go of my hand. How I'd sat in my car in the school parking lot for an hour after drop-off, just in case he needed me. The legal pad filled quickly. I wrote about the night terrors that lasted from age 4 to 7, when he'd wake up screaming about the tall man who lived in his closet. How I'd sit with him until he fell back asleep, sometimes for hours, because Dr. Peterson had said consistency was key to helping him feel safe. I wrote about his imaginary friend, Captain Plum, who was part superhero and part pirate, and who apparently lived in our basement. How I'd learned to set an extra place at dinner for Captain Plum. How I'd have entire conversations with empty air because Theo needed me to acknowledge his invisible companion. How this had lasted until he was 8, when Captain Plum moved to California shortly after Theo made his first real friend at school. The stories kept coming. 3 decades of moments both monumental and mundane. His obsession with dinosaurs that lasted 2 years and required me to become an amateur paleontologist. The way he'd arranged his stuffed animals in precise formations every night, creating what he called protective circles around his bed. His terror of automatic flushing toilets that meant I had to scout out bathroom options wherever we went until he was 12. I wrote about the time he'd asked me, at age 6, if Daddy was cold in heaven, and how I'd spent the next hour explaining that souls don't have bodies and therefore don't experience temperature, only to have him ask if we could send Daddy a sweater anyway, just in case. Each memory felt both precious and painful now, colored by the knowledge that what I'd experienced as profound connection, Cassandra saw as unhealthy enmeshment. But I kept writing because for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was reclaiming something that belonged to me. Around noon, Inez called. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice gentle in the way that meant she was genuinely worried. "I'm writing," I said, not sure how to explain the strange compulsion that had overtaken me. "Writing what?" "Everything. All of it. Every story. Every moment, every single thing I remember about raising Theo." A pause. "Eloise, honey, what are you planning to do with this everything?" I looked down at the legal pad, now covered with my careful handwriting, stories spilling over margins and continuing on additional pages. "I'm going to send it to Cassandra." "Oh, sweetheart. Are you sure that's wise?" "Probably not," I admitted, "but she thinks she knows who I am, and she thinks she understands what my relationship with Theo was like. Maybe it's time she had the complete picture." "And then what? What do you hope to accomplish?" It was a fair question, one I wasn't sure. I could answer honestly. I want her to see him, the real him. Not the 47-year-old lawyer who sits in therapy sessions, but the little boy who was afraid of losing me every single day until he was old enough to understand that mothers don't just disappear. "And you think showing her those stories will, what? Make her more sympathetic, change her mind about you?" "I don't know," I said. "Maybe I just want someone to witness what had actually happened. Maybe I need proof that it was real, that it was love, even if she wants to call it something else." Inez was quiet for a long moment. "You know she might use this against you, right? She might see it as exactly the kind of obsessive behavior she's already accused you of." "Then at least I'll know I told the truth." After we hung up, I continued writing. I filled page after page with memories I'd never shared with anyone. Not because they were secrets, but because they were so ordinary that they'd seemed unremarkable at the time. Only now, viewed through the lens of Cassandra's accusations, did I realize how intimate and specific they were. I wrote about the way Theo had insisted on wearing the same blue-striped shirt for 3 weeks straight when he was 5, until it was literally falling apart because he'd decided it was lucky. How I'd finally convinced him to let me wash it by staying up late to mend the holes and have it ready for him the next morning. I wrote about his habit of leaving me drawings under my pillow. Not special occasion gifts, just random Tuesday afternoon. Expressions of affection that would appear without fanfare or explanation. How I'd kept every single one. Not because I was obsessive, but because they felt like love letters from a child who didn't yet have the vocabulary to express everything he felt. I wrote about the Christmas when he was 9 and had saved up his allowance for 3 months to buy me a ceramic frog from the gift shop at school. How it had cost $3.50 and was possibly the ugliest thing I'd ever seen. But how his face had glowed with pride when he'd presented it to me. How I'd kept it on my nightstand for 8 years, until he'd accidentally knocked it over while helping me move furniture and had burst into tears because he'd broken Mom's favorite thing. How I'd held him while he sobbed apologies, and how he'd never known that I'd been crying too. Not for the broken frog, but for the pure heart that had chosen it as a symbol of love. The afternoon stretched into evening as I continued writing. My hand cramped, but I couldn't stop. Each story felt like evidence, not of manipulation or obsession, but of the daily acts of care that comprise motherhood, the invisible labor of paying attention, of remembering, of bearing witness to another person's growing up. I wrote about scraped knees and hurt feelings, about bedtime stories that stretched on for hours because he'd keep asking, "What happened next?" I wrote about the way he'd practiced his school presentations in front of me, night after night, until he felt confident enough to perform for his classmates. I wrote about his fear of dogs that lasted until he was 10, when Mrs. Patterson's golden retriever, Honey, had somehow convinced him that not all dogs were dangerous. How he'd come home that day, eyes shining with wonder, to tell me that he'd actually petted a dog and it had licked his hand and hadn't bitten him even a little bit. As the light outside my kitchen window began to fade, I realized I had nearly 30 pages of handwritten memories, and I was nowhere near finished. This wasn't just documentation. It was archaeology, the careful excavation of a life lived in service to another person's growth and happiness. Maybe Cassandra was right about one thing. Maybe it was obsessive to remember so much, to have paid such careful attention to the daily details of another person's existence. But if so, it was the kind of obsession that builds human beings, that creates the foundation of security every child needs to believe they matter enough to be seen, known, and remembered. I thought about Theo sitting in Dr. Morrison's office, learning to reframe these same memories as evidence of my inability to let him develop independence. I wondered if he remembered the ceramic frog, if he'd told his therapist about how devastated he'd been when it broke. I wondered if Dr. Morrison had helped him understand that his grief over disappointing me was actually a sign of unhealthy attachment. The phone rang again around 8 o'clock. This time it was Mrs. Whittaker from next door, calling to invite me to her book club meeting on Saturday. "We're reading The Light We Lost," she said. "It's about love and timing and the choices we make. I thought you might enjoy it." I almost laughed at the irony. A book about love and timing, when my own experience with both had apparently been classified as pathological. "That sounds lovely, June. I'll try to make it." "Good. We miss you, Eloise. You've been too quiet lately." After I hung up, I looked down at my pages of memories and wondered if this was what healing looked like. Not the neat, clinical kind that happened in therapy offices, but the messy, complicated kind that happened when you decided to tell your truth regardless of how it might be received. I picked up my pen and continued writing. The writing consumed me for the next week. What had started as a single legal pad expanded into a full composition notebook, then a second one. I found myself remembering details I'd forgotten for years, not just the milestone moments, but the tiny daily interactions that had woven our lives together. I wrote about Theo's questions, the endless stream of curiosity that had characterized his childhood. Why is the sky blue? Where do babies come from? What happens to dogs when they die? If I dig a hole all the way through the earth, where would I end up? Each question had required thoughtful answers, research, sometimes elaborate demonstrations involving flashlights and globes and trips to the library. I wrote about his phases. The month when he would only eat foods that were white, a challenge that required creative meal planning. The summer when he was convinced he could communicate with birds. I'd spent hours sitting silently in the backyard while he made increasingly elaborate chirping sounds. The year when he'd decided to become a marine biologist and had insisted on checking out every book about ocean life from the children's section. The deeper I dug into these memories, the more I understood why Cassandra might find them overwhelming. To an outsider, the sheer volume of attention I'd paid to Theo's inner life could seem excessive. But these weren't the memories of a woman who'd refused to let her child grow up. They were the records of someone who'd been genuinely fascinated by who he was becoming. I remembered the day when he was 7 and had announced that he was going to marry me when he grew up. Instead of laughing or dismissing it as cute childhood confusion, I'd sat down with him and explained carefully about how love between parents and children was different from love between married people, how he would someday find someone special who wasn't his mother to share his life with. He'd considered this seriously, then asked, "But will you still be my mom when I'm married?" "Always," I'd promised. "That never changes." Now, 37 years later, that promise felt naive. Apparently, it did change. Apparently, healthy adult relationships required mothers to become smaller, less significant, carefully managed presences in their children's lives. I wrote about the night when Theo was 12 and had asked me about death, not in general, but specifically about Robert's death, which we'd rarely discussed in detail. He'd wanted to know if his father had been in pain, if he'd been scared, if he'd said anything about Theo before he died. I'd told him the truth, that Robert had been heavily medicated toward the end and mostly unconscious, but that the last, coherent thing he'd said was, "Take care of our boy." How Theo had cried then, not just for the father he'd barely known, but for the weight of being someone's most precious thing. "I wish I remembered him better," he'd said. "You are him, in all the best ways," I'd replied. "You have his kindness, his sense of humor, his stubborn streak when you believe in something. Had that been emotional manipulation? Helping my 12-year-old son feel connected to his deceased father? Or had it been exactly what any loving mother would do, offer comfort and continuity in the face of loss?" I wrote about his teenage years, which had been surprisingly smooth, despite all the warnings about adolescent rebellion. Theo had never been the type to act out dramatically. Instead, he'd grown quieter, more introspective, spending hours in his room reading or working on elaborate drawings of imaginary worlds. I'd worried that his introspection meant depression, had suggested counseling more than once, but he'd always insisted he was fine, just thinking about things. "Big things," he'd say when I'd ask what occupied his thoughts. Like what I want to do with my life and whether I'll be good at it and how to make sure I don't disappoint people. The irony wasn't lost on me that my son, who'd spent his teenage years worried about disappointing people, had grown up to disappoint me in the most fundamental way possible. By the end of the second week, I had filled 3 composition notebooks with memories. The stories ranged from profound to mundane, but they painted a picture of childhood that felt true. Complex, tender, occasionally difficult, always anchored in love. I'd also begun to feel something I hadn't expected. Peace. Not about the situation with Theo, which still felt like an open wound, but about my own role in his life. Reading through these stories, I couldn't find evidence of the manipulative monster Cassandra had described to her mother. Instead, I found a woman who'd taken the enormous responsibility of raising another human being seriously, who'd tried to see him clearly and respond to what he actually needed rather than what was convenient or expected. Had I made mistakes? Certainly. I'd been overprotective about some things, probably too lenient about others. I'd let him quit piano lessons after 2 months, when maybe I should have insisted he stick with it longer. I'd rushed to school with forgotten homework more often than was probably wise. I'd said yes to sleepovers when I'd wanted to say no, had said no to activities that seemed too risky when maybe I should have trusted his judgment more. But overall, reading through these memories felt like reading about love in action, imperfect, sometimes fumbling, but genuine and constant. The hardest part was writing about the recent years, the gradual shift from the close relationship of his childhood to the more distant cordiality that had characterized our interactions since he'd started dating Cassandra. I'd attributed it to natural maturation, the normal process of a man creating space for romantic love in his life. I'd been proud of his ability to form serious relationships, had seen it as evidence that I'd raised him well, secure enough in his mother's love to risk loving someone else. It had never occurred to me that his pulling away wasn't about healthy development, but about choosing sides in a conflict I hadn't realized existed. I wrote about the last Christmas before the wedding, when he'd brought Cassandra home for 3 days, how I'd cleaned the house for a week beforehand, had planned meals around dietary restrictions she'd mentioned, had even bought new towels for the guest bathroom, because the old ones had seemed too worn for someone accustomed to luxury. How careful I'd been during their visit, how consciously I'd tried to give them space while still making them feel welcome, how I'd bitten my tongue when Cassandra had rearranged my spice cabinet to be more efficient, and when she'd suggested I consider selling the house because it was too much space for one person. How Theo had said nothing during these interactions, had simply watched me navigate his fiancée's subtle criticisms with the kind of polite endurance usually reserved for difficult strangers. I'd thought I was being gracious. Apparently, I'd been enabling what Cassandra saw as his inability to establish boundaries. Writing about these more recent memories was painful in a different way than remembering his childhood. The early stories felt like treasures being polished and preserved. These later ones felt like evidence in a case where I'd already been convicted. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But I kept writing because the project had become bigger than just documenting Theo's childhood. It had become an act of reclamation, not just of my role in his life, but of my right to have feelings about losing him, my right to grieve the relationship we'd shared, my right to tell my version of our story. Mrs. Whitaker's book club had provided unexpected comfort. The women there, all my age or older, all with complicated relationships with their adult children, had listened to a sanitized version of my situation with the kind of understanding that comes from shared experience. Children rewrite history when they fall in love, Margaret Peterson had said. Suddenly everything you did for them becomes evidence of what was wrong with their childhood instead of what was right with it. The new wife always knows better, added Dorothy Chen. She's going to fix all the damage the mother supposedly caused, teach him how to have healthy relationships. Never mind that his relationship with his mother might have been the healthiest thing about him. Their words had been balm to wounds I'd been trying to heal alone. But they'd also confirmed my growing suspicion that what was happening to me wasn't unique or personal. It was part of a larger pattern, a cultural narrative about mothers who love too much and wives who love more wisely. I'd started to wonder if the real issue wasn't my relationship with Theo, but Cassandra's discomfort with relationships that predated her. If what she saw as unhealthy attachment was actually her own insecurity about competing with decades of shared history. But wondering didn't change the facts. My son had chosen her version of events over mine, had decided that cutting me out of his life was necessary for his psychological health. As I filled the fourth notebook, I began to feel ready to share these stories with the person who'd inspired them, not because I thought they would change Cassandra's mind about me, but because I needed her to understand what she'd convinced Theo to throw away. I needed her to see that what she'd dismissed as obsessive documentation was actually the careful preservation of a life lived consciously, attention paid deliberately, love offered consistently, even when it wasn't easy or convenient. If she still wanted to call that emotional manipulation, after reading these stories, at least she'd be making an informed judgment rather than one based on assumptions and prejudice. The question was how to give them to her. Mailing them felt impersonal. Showing up at their apartment felt invasive. I needed a way to share these stories that honored their weight and significance while respecting the boundaries that had been so carefully established around my contact with their life. The answer came to me on a Thursday afternoon while I was organizing the notebooks into chronological order. I would create something that couldn't be easily dismissed or thrown away, something that demanded to be acknowledged, even if it was ultimately rejected. I would turn these memories into a book, not a published book, but a handmade one, carefully crafted and bound, with a title page and dedication, something that looked and felt important, that communicated the care and attention that had gone into both the remembering and the recording. If Cassandra wanted to understand what 47 years of obsessive motherhood looked like, I would show her exactly that, but in a form beautiful enough to honor the love it contained. Creating the book became a meditation on motherhood itself. I spent 3 days at the computer, typing out all the handwritten stories, editing them not for content but for clarity, organizing them into chapters that followed Theo's development, from toddler to young man. The stories fell naturally into sections. Early years covered ages 2 through 7. The wonder years captured 8 through 12. Becoming himself chronicled his teenage development, and Growing Away documented the gradual shift toward independence in his 20s and 30s. Each chapter began with a photograph. Theo at various ages, sometimes alone, sometimes with me, always captured in moments of genuine joy or concentration. I'd scan them at high resolution, adjusting the color and contrast until they looked professional, or worthy of the stories they introduced. The title came to me as I was arranging the final layout. The Boy Who Became Theodore, a mother's record of love in action. It felt both personal and universal, specific to our story, but recognizable to anyone who'd ever watched a child grow up. On the dedication page, I wrote simply, "For Cassandra, who may not understand this love but deserves to know it existed." Tartoir, local print shop, had looked at me strangely when I'd asked them to bind the 100-page document with a hardcover and dust jacket. But they'd done beautiful work. The finished product looked like something you might find in a bookstore. Professional, substantial, undeniably real. Holding it in my hands for the first time, I felt a mixture of pride and terror. This wasn't just a collection of memories anymore. It was a manifesto, a declaration of the validity of my experience as Theo's mother. It was also potentially the most vulnerable thing I'd ever created. My heart laid bare on high-quality paper, bound in navy blue cloth. I'd planned to mail it with a simple note explaining my intentions. But as I sat at my kitchen table trying to compose that note, I realized I had no idea what my intentions actually were. Did I want Cassandra to read these stories and realize she'd misjudged me? Did I hope she'd share them with Theo and facilitate some kind of reconciliation? Or was I simply creating a permanent record of something precious that was being erased from history. The answer came in the form of an unexpected phone call on Saturday afternoon. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar. Theo's friend Marcus, whom I'd known since his college days. Mrs. Hartley? I hope it's okay that I'm calling. I got your number from my mum. Marcus had been Theo's roommate senior year, had spent countless weekends at our house, had become almost like a second son to me. After graduation, he'd moved to Chicago, but we'd exchanged Christmas cards and occasional emails over the years. Marcus, what a wonderful surprise. How are you? I'm well, thanks. Actually, I'm calling because I was in Boston last week on business, and I tried to connect with Theo. We went out for drinks and... He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Mrs. Hartley, I think there are some things you should know. My heart rate increased. What kind of things? About what's really going on with Theo and Cassandra, and why he's been distant. Marcus had always been direct, one of the qualities I'd appreciated about him during his friendship with Theo. But now his careful tone suggested he was navigating sensitive territory. I'm listening, I said. Okay, so we were having drinks, catching up, and I asked about you, how you were doing, whether you liked living alone in the house, that kind of thing. And Theo got really uncomfortable. Said you two weren't talking much anymore because Cassandra thought some space would be healthy. I was writing down his words as he spoke, though I didn't know why. I pushed a little because, honestly, that didn't sound like the Theo I knew. And eventually he admitted that Cassandra had basically given him an ultimatum. Either he established appropriate boundaries with you, or she wasn't sure she could stay in the marriage. The pen slipped from my hand. She threatened divorce? Not explicitly, but she made it clear that your relationship with him was a deal-breaker for her. She said she couldn't build a life with someone who was enmeshed with his mother. Marcus continued, his voice gentle but determined. Mrs. Hartley, I've known Theo for 20 years. I've seen how he talks about you, how proud he's always been of the relationship you two have. This isn't him choosing to cut you out. This is him being forced to choose between his mother and his wife. I closed my eyes, feeling pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The stiffness at the wedding, the gradual decrease in phone calls, the rehearsed quality of his voice during our last conversation. None of it had been about healthy boundaries or psychological growth. It had been about survival in a marriage that couldn't tolerate his history. There's more, Marcus said. Theo's been drinking more than usual, a lot more, and he looks, I don't know how to describe it, smaller somehow, like he's been folded in half and can't straighten out anymore. The image was heartbreaking and familiar. I'd seen Theo fold into himself before, during difficult times in his childhood when he'd felt overwhelmed or conflicted. But he'd always been able to talk to me about those feelings, to unfold in the safety of our relationship. Did he say anything else about the situation? He said Cassandra had been tracking his therapy sessions, making sure he was making progress on establishing independence from you. She'd found old photos on his phone, pictures of you two from various holidays and trips, and had made him delete them because she said keeping them showed he was stuck in the past. I thought about all the photos I'd taken over the years, the careful documentation of our shared experiences that Cassandra had seen as evidence of my obsession. Apparently, she'd seen them as threats to be eliminated. Marcus, why are you telling me this? Because Theo's miserable, and because what's happening isn't fair to either of you. I don't know Cassandra well, but from what I've observed, she's trying to erase his entire life before he met her. And Theo's letting her do it because he's convinced himself that's what love requires. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. The situation was worse than I'd imagined. This wasn't about Theo outgrowing his need for his mother. It was about Cassandra systematically dismantling every connection to his pre-marriage life. I thought about the book I'd created, sitting on my table ready to be mailed. Suddenly, sending those memories to Cassandra felt less like sharing and more like handing ammunition to someone who'd already declared war on my relationship with my son. But Marcus's call had also clarified something important. Theo wasn't the enemy. He was a casualty, caught between loyalties he shouldn't have been forced to choose between. The man I'd raised to be compassionate and conscientious was being manipulated into betraying his own history in service of someone else's insecurity. That understanding changed everything about what I wanted to accomplish with the book. I wasn't trying to convince Cassandra to like me or approve of my parenting. I was trying to remind her, and through her, Theo, that some things are too precious to be sacrificed for the illusion of marital harmony. I was trying to save not just my relationship with my son, but his relationship with himself, the part of him that had been shaped by our love, that had learned to trust and be trusted, that had developed empathy and resilience through years of being seen and cherished. If Cassandra had convinced him that those qualities were actually weaknesses that needed to be overcome, then she wasn't just threatening his connection to me. She was threatening the foundation of who he was as a person. The book wasn't just a record of our relationship anymore. It was a mirror, a way of showing Theo who he used to be before he'd learned to see his own loving nature as pathology. I picked up the pen and began writing a new kind of note to accompany the book. Not a plea for understanding, but a statement of fact. Not an apology for having loved him completely, but an invitation to remember what that love had created. Dear Cassandra, I wrote, I understand that you see my relationship with Theo as unhealthy. I respect your right to that opinion, even though I disagree with it. What I cannot accept is the suggestion that 45 years of shared history should be forgotten or dismissed in service of someone else's comfort. The stories in this book are not weapons or manipulation. They are simply the truth of what happened between a mother and her son. Theo lived these moments. He was shaped by them. Pretending they didn't exist doesn't make him healthier. It makes him smaller. I hope that after reading this, you'll understand that loving him means accepting all of him, including the parts that were formed before he met you. I signed it simply Eloise and slipped it inside the front cover of the book. Then I drove to their apartment complex, not to confront anyone or make a scene, but to leave the book where it couldn't be ignored or thrown away without being seen. I placed it by their door with a small note that said, "This belongs to your family now." As I drove home, I felt lighter than I had in weeks, not because I expected the book to fix anything, but because I'd finally done something that felt true to who I was, a mother who'd spent 47 years paying attention, who refused to pretend that attention had been wasted or wrong. Whatever happened next, I'd told my truth, and sometimes that's the only victory available. 3 days passed without any response to the book, and I found myself existing in a strange state of suspended animation. I'd done the only thing I could think of to honor both my love for Theo and my respect for the boundaries that had been established around their marriage. Now I could only wait and see what, if anything, would come of it. I tried to maintain normal routines. I watered the violets, organized my bookshelves, attended Mrs. Whitaker's book club meeting, where we discussed love and loss and the ways people choose to remember or forget their past. I even volunteered for an extra shift at the literacy center, helping adults learn to read with the same patience I'd once brought to teaching Theo about letters and sounds. But underneath the surface normalcy, I felt like I was holding my breath. The call came on Thursday evening while I was making dinner. The phone rang at exactly 6:15, and when I saw Theo's name on the caller ID, my heart nearly stopped. I let it ring 3 times, trying to compose myself before answering. "Hello?" "Mom." His voice sounded strained, tired in a way that reminded me of his college years during finals week. "We need to talk." "Okay," I said, sitting down at the kitchen table because my legs suddenly felt unsteady. "Cassandra and I read your book. We read the whole thing." I waited, not trusting myself to speak without betraying how desperately I wanted to know their reaction. "I don't even know where to start," he continued. "Some of those stories, I had forgotten some of those things completely." "Which things?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. "Captain Plum. The protective circles with my stuffed animals. The way I used to leave you drawings under your pillow." His voice caught slightly. "The ceramic frog." I closed my eyes, remembering the weight of that small, ugly, beloved object in my hands. "Mom, why did you write this? What were you trying to accomplish?" It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself for days. I wanted her to understand what she was asking you to throw away. I wanted both of you to remember that what we had wasn't pathological. It was love. "Cassandra says..." He paused, and I could hear muffled conversation in the background. "She says you're trying to manipulate me into feeling guilty for establishing boundaries. Is that what you think?" Another pause. Longer this time. I don't know what I think anymore. Reading those stories was like remembering a person I used to be but forgot about. "You didn't forget, sweetheart. You just learned to see that person differently. Dr. Morrison says that kind of emotional intensity between a parent and child isn't healthy, that it creates dependency and makes it harder to form mature relationships." I thought about all the mature relationships Theo had formed over the years. Friendships that had lasted decades, professional connections built on trust and respect, the capacity for loyalty and empathy that had made him successful both personally and professionally. Had those qualities emerged despite my love, or because of it? "Theo, can I ask you something? Do you remember why you became a lawyer? What does that have to do with anything? Just, do you remember?" A sigh. "Because I wanted to help people. Because I thought the law could be a tool for fairness when nothing else worked." "And where do you think that desire to help people came from? That belief that fairness matters?" He stopped, and I could almost hear him thinking. "I don't know. I just always felt that way." "You felt that way because from the time you were 2 years old, someone paid attention to what was fair and what wasn't in your small world. Someone made sure your feelings mattered, that your perspective was heard, that justice existed even in everyday conflicts. You learned to value those things because you experienced them." "Mom, that's not..." "Dr. Morrison says..." "I don't care what Dr. Morrison says," I interrupted, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "Dr. Morrison never met the little boy who cried for an hour when he accidentally stepped on a butterfly. He never saw you give half your Halloween candy to your friend Derek because Derek's parents couldn't afford to buy costumes. He never watched you spend your own allowance to buy a birthday present for the kid in your class that nobody else liked." I was crying now, but my voice remained steady. "Dr. Morrison sees pathology where I see the foundation of everything good about who you are. And if Cassandra can't see that too, then she doesn't really know you at all. The silence stretched. So long I wondered if the call had dropped. When Theo finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. She wants me to throw the book away. She says keeping it would be backsliding, and that we should probably go no contact with you permanently if we're going to have children someday. The words hit like a physical blow, not just the threat of permanent estrangement, but the casual way he'd mentioned children. Grandchildren I might never meet, lives that would grow up without any knowledge of my existence. Is that what you want? I asked. I want... His voice broke. I want to stop feeling like I'm betraying someone, no matter what I choose. I want to stop feeling guilty for missing you, and guilty for wanting to see you, and guilty for every good memory I have of being your son. Oh, honey. I love her, Mom. I really do. And she loves me. But she says I have to choose between the past and the future, between being your son and being her husband. And I don't know how to do that without losing part of myself. I sat in my kitchen, listening to my 47-year-old son cry over the phone, and felt something crystallize inside me. This wasn't about me anymore. This wasn't about my hurt feelings or my need to be acknowledged or my fear of being forgotten. This was about protecting my child from being forced to amputate healthy parts of himself in service of someone else's. Insecurity. Theo, listen to me. You don't have to choose between the past and the future. Anyone who loves you completely should want you to keep the best parts of your history, not throw them away. Love doesn't require you to become less than you are. It helps you become more. But she says, I know what she says, and I understand that she's the person you've chosen to build a life with. But sweetheart, a marriage that requires you to forget where you came from isn't a marriage. It's a prison. I can't lose her, Mom. I can't lose another person I love. The admission broke my heart in new ways. Of course he was terrified of loss. He'd learned early that people you love can disappear without warning. But instead of helping him build on the security our relationship had provided, Cassandra was exploiting his fear, using it to control him. You won't lose her if she really loves you, I said. And if you do lose her, it will be because she couldn't love all of you. And that's not a loss you should fear. That's a bullet you should be grateful to dodge. More silence then. What am I supposed to do? You're supposed to remember who you are. You're supposed to stand up for the person you've always been, instead of apologizing for him. You're supposed to find someone who celebrates your capacity for love, instead of pathologizing it. She's my wife, Mom. I know. And that means something. But it doesn't mean everything. It doesn't mean she gets to rewrite your entire history or demand that you pretend the first 46 years of your life didn't matter. I could hear Cassandra's voice in the background, sharp and insistent, though I couldn't make out the words. I have to go, Theo said quickly. But Mom, thank you for the book, for remembering all of it. Even if I can't. Even if things don't change. Thank you for seeing me that clearly for so long. I see you clearly now too, sweetheart. You're still that boy who saved his allowance to buy presents for lonely kids. You're still the person who cries over stepped-on butterflies. Don't let anyone convince you that those qualities are weaknesses. I love you, Mom. I love you too, always. After he hung up, I sat in my kitchen as darkness fell outside, feeling like I'd just fought the most important battle of my life. Not for my relationship with Theo, but for his relationship with himself. Whatever happened next, I'd reminded him who he was before he'd learned to see his own loving nature as pathology. And sometimes, that's all a mother can do. Hold up a mirror that reflects the truth about the person you raised, and hope they recognize themselves in it clearly enough to resist being diminished by someone else's fear. The confrontation came at 7:30 on Friday evening, exactly 24 hours after my phone call with Theo. I was washing dishes when I heard the car doors slam in my driveway, followed by the sharp staccato of high heels on my front walk. I dried my hands slowly, knowing without looking that Cassandra had come to finish what she'd started. The doorbell rang twice in quick succession, impatient and demanding. When I opened the door, Cassandra stood on my front step, holding the book I'd created, her face tight with barely controlled anger. Theo stood behind her looking pale and defeated, like a man being marched to his execution. "We need to discuss this," Cassandra said without preamble, waving the book at me. "This manipulation, this emotional blackmail." "Hello, Cassandra. Hello, Theo." I stepped back from the door. "Please come in." They followed me into the living room, where Cassandra immediately began pacing, while Theo sat heavily on the couch, his head in his hands. The book lay on my coffee table between us like evidence in a trial. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Cassandra asked. "Do you understand how destructive this little stunt of yours has been?" I sat in my armchair, the same one where I'd rocked Theo to sleep countless times during his childhood, and folded my hands in my lap. I shared memories of my son's childhood with his wife. I'm not sure how that qualifies as destructive. "You cherry-picked stories designed to make me look like the villain for trying to help my husband develop healthy boundaries. You deliberately painted yourself as some kind of saint and made me out to be the evil stepmother trying to steal him away from his devoted mother. I wrote the truth about what happened between Theo and me over the course of 45 years. If that truth makes you uncomfortable, perhaps you should ask yourself why." Cassandra stopped pacing and fixed me with a look of pure contempt. "The truth? You mean the truth about how you made him responsible for your emotional well-being from the time he was a toddler? How you trained him to see your happiness as his job? How you documented every breath he took like some kind of stalker? Cassandra?" Theo's voice was quiet but firm. "That's enough." She whirled to face him. "No, it's not enough. She's trying to manipulate you into feeling guilty for choosing our marriage over this unhealthy obsession she calls love." "She's not manipulating me," Theo said, lifting his head to look at her. "She's reminding me of who I used to be before I learned to see everything good about myself as pathology. Who you used to be was emotionally dependent and incapable of mature relationships. Who I used to be," Theo said, standing up slowly, "was someone who knew how to love people without conditions. Someone who believed that caring about others was a strength, not a weakness. Someone who understood that family doesn't end when you get married. It expands." I watched my son find his voice and felt pride mixed with heartbreak. This was the boy I'd raised, thoughtful, principled, willing to stand up for what he believed. And even when it was difficult, Cassandra's face had gone white. "So that's it? You're choosing her over me? Over our marriage?" "I'm choosing not to pretend that the first 46 years of my life were some kind of psychological damage that needs to be healed. I'm choosing to stop being ashamed of the fact that I love my mother and she loves me." "Love?" Cassandra laughed bitterly. "That's not love, Theo. That's enmeshment. That's codependency," Dr. Morrison explained. "Dr. Morrison has never met my mother," Theo interrupted. "He's never seen her prioritize my needs over her own for decades. He's never watched her celebrate my independence even when it meant less contact with me. He's making judgments based on your interpretation of our relationship, not on the actual relationship itself. I stayed quiet, letting him work through thoughts that clearly needed to be voiced. Reading that book? Theo's voice grew stronger. It reminded me of things I'd forgotten. Not just events, but feelings. The security of knowing someone was paying attention, someone cared enough to remember details, someone thought I was worth documenting. He turned to look at me, and I saw tears in his eyes. Do you know what I realized? That everything Dr. Morrison calls unhealthy attachment, I call the foundation of my ability to trust people. Every quality that makes me good at my job, good with my friends, good at understanding what people need. It all traces back to having someone who paid that kind of attention to who I was. Cassandra was shaking her head. You're romanticizing it. You're forgetting the pressure, the guilt, the way she made you responsible for her happiness. When? Theo asked. Give me one specific example of her making me responsible for her happiness. The way she saved everything. The way she documented every moment. Normal mothers don't keep that kind of record. It's obsessive. Normal mothers don't raise their children alone for 43 years, I said quietly. Normal mothers have partners to share the daily details with, to help them process and remember. I kept those records because I was the only witness to his childhood, and I thought someday he might want to know what he was like, before he was old enough to remember it himself. Theo was staring at me. Is that really why you kept everything? Partly, but mostly because watching you grow up was the most interesting thing that ever happened to me. You were fascinating. The way your mind worked, the questions you asked, the way you saw the world. I documented it for the same reason people photograph sunsets or keep journals about trips to beautiful places. I wanted to remember what it felt like to witness something extraordinary. See? Cassandra said triumphantly. Right there. Making him responsible for being the most interesting thing in your life. That's exactly the kind of pressure. Stop! Theo's voice cut through, her words like a blade. Just stop. He walked to the mantel where his school photos still stood in their frames, picked up one from his high school graduation, and studied it for a long moment. You know what I remember about this day, he said finally. I was terrified about going to college, about leaving home, about whether I'd be able to make friends and succeed academically. And Mom spent the entire morning telling me how proud she was, how excited she was for me to have new adventures, how confident she was that I'd figure everything out. He set the photo down and turned to face Cassandra. She didn't cling or cry or make me feel guilty for leaving. She celebrated my independence even though it meant she'd be alone in this house for the first time in 18 years. That's not enmeshment. That's love. Theo, please. You're letting her manipulate you again. Can't you see what she's doing? What I see, Theo said slowly, is that my mother spent 45 years helping me become the kind of person who could love deeply and commit completely. And now you're asking me to throw that away because it makes you uncomfortable. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. The same clock that had marked time through thousands of ordinary moments that had shaped us both. Finally, Cassandra spoke, her voice cold and controlled. If you choose her over our marriage, I won't stay. I can't build a life with someone who refuses to prioritize our relationship. I'm not choosing anyone over anyone, Theo replied. I'm choosing to stop pretending that loving my mother is incompatible with loving my wife. I'm choosing to stop being ashamed of qualities that make me a better person. I'm choosing to stop seeing psychological health as requiring me to amputate healthy relationships. He looked at me, then back at Cassandra, and I'm choosing to stop going to a therapist who's more interested in pathologizing love than understanding it. Cassandra's composure cracked. You're making a terrible mistake. You're choosing dysfunction over growth, enmeshment over independence. I, sir, choosing wholeness over fragmentation, Theo said. I'm choosing to be all of who I am instead of the edited version you're more comfortable with. She stared at him for a long moment, and I could see her calculating, trying to find another angle of approach. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted from anger to hurt. I love you, Theo. Everything I've done has been because I love you and want what's best for us. I know you do, he said gently. But love doesn't require me to become smaller. Love doesn't ask me to forget where I came from, or pretend that the people who shaped me don't matter. So, where does that leave us? Theo looked at me, then back at her, and I saw him making a choice that would define the rest of his life. It leaves us figuring out how to build a marriage that has a room for all the people we love. Not just each other. It leaves us learning how to expand our family instead of defending it. It leaves us deciding whether our love is big enough to include the people who made us who we are. Cassandra picked up the book from the coffee table and held it against her chest like a shield. And if I can't do that? If I can't accept this intensity between you two? Then you'll have to decide what matters more to you, controlling who I love or loving who I am. The question hung in the air like smoke, visible and choking. I watched my son stand his ground against someone he loved, watched him choose truth over peace, watched him reclaim the person he'd been before he'd learned to see his own loving nature as weakness. Whatever happened next, he'd remembered who he was, and sometimes that's the only victory possible. 6 months later, I was arranging spring flowers in the same crystal vase where this story began when I heard Theo's key in the front door. He'd been coming by every Sunday for the past 4 months, a tradition we'd re-established after what he now called the intervention, though I preferred to think of it as the remembering. "Mom?" he called out, the way he had as a child returning from school. "In the kitchen," I replied, the way I always had. He appeared in the doorway carrying grocery bags and wearing the kind of relaxed expression I hadn't seen on his face in years. The weight he'd carried during those months of forced estrangement had lifted, and he looked like himself again. Not the edited version Cassandra had preferred, but the whole person I'd raised. "I brought supplies for dinner," he said, setting the bags on the counter. "And I have news." I waited while he unpacked ingredients for his signature pasta dish, a recipe he'd perfected during college. His movements were easy, familiar, at home in this kitchen where he'd learned to cook, to clean up after himself, to take care of others. "Cassandra and I are getting divorced," he said without preamble, the way he'd always delivered important news, directly, without dramatics. I set down the flower I'd been arranging. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. Are you okay?" He considered the question seriously, the way he'd always considered questions that mattered. "I'm sad about it, but I'm also relieved, and I think that tells me everything I need to know about whether it was the right decision." Over the past months, Theo had returned to individual therapy with a different counselor, Dr. Sarah Chen, who specialized in family systems and understood that healthy relationships could take many forms. He'd also slowly begun rebuilding connections with friends he'd distanced himself from during his marriage, rediscovering parts of himself that had been dormant. "She tried," he continued, filling a pot with water for the pasta. "After that night, Here, she really did try to understand. She read parenting books about attachment theory, talked to her own therapist about her discomfort with close family relationships. But ultimately, she couldn't accept that my relationship with you wasn't something that needed to be fixed. I thought about Cassandra, who'd grown up in a family where love was expressed through achievement and distance, where emotional intensity was seen as weakness rather than strength. In her world, my relationship with Theo probably did look excessive, unhealthy, potentially threatening. "Do you think she ever read the whole book?" I asked. Theo smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in over a year. "She did, actually. Cover to cover. And you know what she said afterward. Now I understand why you turned out the way you did." "And how did you turn out?" According to her, too sensitive, too loyal, too willing to put other people's needs ahead of my own. Too quick to forgive, too slow to hold grudges, too interested in emotional intimacy. He paused, stirring the pasta sauce. "Basically, all the things that make me good at loving people." We cooked together in comfortable silence, falling back into rhythms we'd established decades earlier. He told me about work, about a case he was handling for a nonprofit that provided legal services to elderly clients facing housing discrimination. I told him about the Literacy Center, about Mrs. Whitaker's latest book club selection, about the new volunteer who reminded me of him at 25. After dinner, we sat in the living room with coffee, and he asked the question I'd been expecting. "Do you think I made the right choice, ending the marriage?" I studied his face, looking for signs of doubt or regret, but finding only the peaceful exhaustion that comes after making a difficult decision for the right reasons. "I think you made the only choice that allowed you to keep being yourself," I said. "And I think someday you'll find someone who loves you because of who you are, not despite it. Dr. Chen says the same thing. She also says that what Cassandra called enmeshment, she'd call secure attachment. Apparently, having a parent who was consistently available and emotionally attuned actually makes it easier to form healthy relationships, not harder." "What a revolutionary concept," I said dryly, making him laugh. "She wants to meet you, actually. Dr. Chen. She's doing research on adult children of single mothers, looking at outcomes and attachment patterns. She says our relationship sounds like a textbook example of resilient attachment." I thought about all the therapy sessions where our love had been pathologized, dissected, diagnosed as unhealthy. The irony wasn't lost on me that different experts could look at the same relationship and reach completely opposite conclusions. "Would you be comfortable with that?" Theo asked. "Meeting with her. Maybe answering some questions about your experience raising me." "If you think it would be helpful, of course." He was quiet for a moment, looking around the room at the photos and memories that had once been used as evidence against us. "You know what I've realized? Cassandra was right about one thing. You did document everything. But she was wrong about why. You weren't trying to possess me or control me. You were trying to see me." I felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "You were worth seeing. And you were worth having as a mother. Not perfect, not without flaws, but worth having, worth keeping, worth celebrating instead of healing from." As evening fell, Theo helped me clear the dishes and prepare for his departure. But instead of the hurried goodbye that had characterized our visits during his marriage, he lingered, comfortable in the house that held his history. "I've been thinking about dating again," he said as he gathered his jacket. "But differently this time. Dr. Chen says I should look for someone who's curious about my past instead of threatened by it. Someone who wants to understand the people who shaped me instead of competing with them." That sounds wise. She also says I should probably mention my close relationship with my mother early in the dating process. Kind of like a screening tool. Anyone who sees that as a red flag probably isn't someone I want to build a life with anyway. I hugged him. Goodbye at the front door, the same door where I'd once kissed scraped knees, and sent him off to school with lunch money and encouragement. He felt solid in my arms, present in a way he hadn't been during those months of forced distance. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for writing that book, for not letting me forget who I was." "Thank you for remembering," I replied, "for choosing to be all of yourself instead of just the part someone else could accept." After he left, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea, looking at the violets on the windowsill that had survived another New England winter. Outside, spring was taking hold. Cautious at first, then with increasing confidence, the way healing happens when you stop forcing it and simply allow its space to unfold. I thought about the book I'd written, how it had started as a desperate attempt to save my relationship with my son and had become something larger. A declaration of the validity of love that doesn't apologize for its depth or intensity. A reminder that some bonds are too precious to be sacrificed for the comfort of those who don't understand them. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Inez's name appeared on the caller ID. "How did dinner go?" she asked without preamble. "They're getting divorced," I said. "Good." She was never right for him anyway. Too brittle, too worried about what things looked like instead of what they felt like. Inez. What? I'm allowed to have opinions about people who try to steal my nephew. I smiled, touched by her fierce loyalty. He seems okay with it. Sad, but okay. Of course he's okay. He's got his mother back. And now he can find someone who appreciates what a good job you did raising him, instead of someone who resents it. After we hung up, I walked through my house, turning off lights and checking locks. The same routine I'd followed for decades. In the hallway, I paused in front of the bookshelf that held all those photo albums Cassandra had found so troubling. Now they looked like what they'd always been. Not evidence of obsession, but proof of attention. Not documentation of enmeshment, but celebration of growth. Not pathological attachment, but love made visible. Love preserved for the moments when memory needed reinforcement. I pulled out the album from Theo's kindergarten year and flipped through pages of school events and birthday parties, of gap-toothed smiles and Halloween costumes. On the last page, I'd written a note to my future self. Remember this. How proud you were. How amazed you were by who he was becoming. How grateful you felt to be the one watching it happen. I'd been right to document it all. Right to pay attention. Right to love as deeply and completely as I'd known how. The fact that someone else had seen pathology where I'd seen devotion said more about their limitations than mine. Upstairs in my bedroom, I opened the drawer of my nightstand and pulled out a new notebook I'd been keeping since that confrontation 6 months ago. This one wasn't about Theo. It was about me, about the woman who'd existed before motherhood and who was slowly remembering herself now. That active parenting was complete. I wrote about the garden I was planning for this spring. More ambitious than any I'd attempted in years. I wrote about the photography class I'd signed up for at the community college. About my plans to volunteer at the Historical Society. About the trip to Ireland I was considering for my 73rd birthday. Wrote about learning to live fully in my own story, instead of just as a character in someone else's. About discovering what it meant to love myself with the same attention I'd lavished on my son. The last entry, written just that morning, said simply, "Today I am proud of the mother I was, grateful for the woman I am, and curious about who I'm still becoming. Outside my window, the moon was full and bright, illuminating the garden where Theo had once played superhero and buried treasure and practiced being brave. Tomorrow I would plant the bulbs I'd ordered, daffodils and tulips that would push through the soil in defiance of winter's hold, that would bloom regardless of who was watching, that would return year after year because that's what living things do when they're planted in good soil and tended with care. Just like children, just like love, just like the parts of ourselves that matter most. I closed the notebook and turned off the light, ready for whatever was coming next. I used to believe that when a chapter in your life ended, the only way forward was to turn the page. But I've learned since then that some endings aren't as clean as paper. Some endings echo, some linger, and some demand not just a turning of the page, but the planting of new roots in the soil of the story you thought was finished. It's been nearly a year since Theo left Cassandra, a year since the book I wrote about our life, about his life, was left on their apartment doorstep like a message in a bottle. That book cracked something open that had been sealed shut for too long, not just between us, but within both of us. When I first saw him standing on my front porch again after all those months, heavier in his silence, aged by the weight of being misunderstood, I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know if he'd come to say goodbye or to finally say something true. What he said was this: I want to remember who I was before I started apologizing for it. That was the start. Since then, Sunday dinners have resumed. They are smaller, quieter affairs now, without Cassandra's clipped tone or forced politeness. Just the two of us, like it once was. I don't overcook or overprepare like I used to. Just roasted vegetables, a pot of stew, the bread he likes, from Miller's Market. At first, he was tentative, as if testing the floorboards of our old rhythm. But over time, the stiffness faded. He smiled more. He laughed more, freely. Not the careful, diplomatic laugh I'd heard during his marriage. And he talked. He told me how lonely he'd felt, even in a shared bed. How much energy he'd spent, managing Cassandra's emotions, proving his independence, rationing his past. How the therapy sessions that were supposed to help him separate from me had slowly unspooled into confusion and guilt. I started to believe I was broken. He admitted once, as we sat on the porch watching dusk fall over the garden, like loving too much, remembering too much, made me defective. I listened without interrupting. I've learned not to jump in to soothe, not to reframe everything in a rush to protect him from pain. Instead, I nodded and let the words settle. Between us, like dust on a windowsill, they mattered. They were real. You weren't broken, I finally said. You were made to remember. That's not a flaw, Theo. That's a gift. He looked at me then, and I saw the boy who used to ask, "Will I still be your son when I grow up?" And I saw the man who had lived that question for too long, afraid the answer was no. And now, slowly, he was unlearning the fear. Some nights I sit with that book again, the one I wrote when I thought I'd never speak to him again. I turn the pages not to relive the past, but to remind myself of what it took to get here. There's something about reading your own truth back to yourself. Not the revised version others demand, but the raw, unfiltered history you lived. Those notebooks saved me. They helped me step out of the role of just a mother and into the fullness of my own identity. A witness, a storyteller. A woman whose memories are not a burden, but a testimony. I've since started writing again. Not about Theo, but about myself. About being a widow at 31. About rebuilding a life while raising a child who didn't yet know what he'd lost, about running a library when your own house is too full of stories to fit one more. These pages are different from the ones I filled for Theo. These are mine alone, unshared, unperformed, unfiltered, and perhaps for the first time, I'm not writing them for someone else's approval. Inez, ever practical, ever resilient, has taken to calling me the comeback. Queen, you went from banned to beloved. She jokes. That's gotta be worth a memoir deal. We laugh about it, but there's a sting beneath the humor. Inez knows how close I came to losing myself in that silence. How grief, even the living kind, can strip you of your reflection if you're not careful. You know what changed? I asked her once. I stopped apologizing for remembering. It's the one lesson I hope Theo keeps. Memory is not the enemy of growth. It is its root system. Spring turned to summer, and with it came changes neither of us could have predicted. Theo asked if he could store some boxes in my attic, the last remnants of his life with Cassandra. Law books, old sweaters, framed degrees. Among them was a small wooden box I hadn't seen in years. I found this in storage, he said, handing it to me. Figured you'd want it. Inside were artifacts of a boyhood I thought lost, a chipped blue marble, the worn vampire cape from those Halloweens, a handwritten poem about dinosaurs titled Jurassic Love. My heart stuttered. Not because I'd forgotten, but because I hadn't known he'd remembered too. These are yours, I said, handing the box back. He shook his head. They're ours. We sat cross-legged on the floor of the attic, passing, the objects between us like communion wafers, tokens of a language we once spoke fluently, the marble, the cape, the crayon drawings. Each one said what words never quite could. We were real. We were good. We mattered. It's not all healed, of course. I still flinch when the phone doesn't ring on schedule. Still wonder if Cassandra's voice lingers in the back of his mind, whispering half-truths about boundaries and guilt. Still feel the old ache when I pass Miller's Market, and remember overhearing her words like a knife between the ribs. But pain has become a companion now, not an enemy, just a quiet reminder of how deep love goes when it's rooted in real history. And there's beauty in that too. Recently, Theo told me he's thinking about moving back to our town, not with any grand declarations or timelines, just a gentle wondering. There's something comforting about being close to where you were known first, he said. I didn't say what I wanted to, that he'd never been unknown here, that, even in his absence, his presence was in the walls, the door frames, the garden beds. That no matter how far he ran, this place had always been ready to remember him. Instead, I said, there's room here. Always. The garden has bloomed more beautifully than ever this year. Inez swears it's the compost, but I think it's something else. Maybe the ground can sense healing. Maybe violets know when grief has softened into wisdom. I've planted new things, too. Mint, lavender, tomatoes in raised beds. Life that requires tending but not obsession. Roots that go deep, but don't strangle. Theo helped me one Saturday, rolling up his sleeves, digging holes with the same intensity he once gave to Lego sets and science projects. We worked in companionable silence until he said, "You know what I regret most?" I paused, wiping sweat from my brow. "What?" "That I believed you were the problem. I stood there, covered in dirt and sunlight, and 1,000 past conversations, and said, we all believe what we need to believe to survive. The trick is learning how to live once the story changes. The story has changed. We are no longer mother and boy, clinging to each other like lifeboats in a storm. We are adults, connected not by obligation but by choice, by memory, by love, and by a shared refusal to let anyone rewrite our history into something it never was. I still don't know what the future holds. Whether Theo will remarry, whether he'll move back, whether grandchildren are ever in the cards. But I no longer live in suspense. I live in presence, in the garden, in my writing, in the gentle rhythm of Sundays and stories, flowers and forgiveness. This is part one of our after, not an ending, just a quieter, deeper beginning. By early autumn, the leaves had begun their slow surrender, drifting onto the porch in golden layers. I swept them each morning as I always had, not out of obligation but as a kind of ritual, a gentle reminder that even the beautiful things must fall sometimes, and that falling doesn't mean failure, it just means change. Theo was visiting more regularly by then, not just on Sundays but in between, after court hearings, after long walks, or just because the weight of being in his own apartment without Cassandra had begun to lift, and he didn't want to waste the lightness. We'd settled into a rhythm again, not quite the same as it had been when he was a child, but real nonetheless. This version of us felt earned, honest, unafraid of silence. One evening he brought over a folder full of old essays and school projects. "You kept everything," he said with a half smile, laying out papers on the table. "Even this one about wanting to be a superhero named Justice Hawk." "You wrote that when you were 8, I said, thumbing through the crayon-scribbled pages. "And don't forget, Justice Hawk had a sidekick named Legal Beagle." Theo laughed. "God, I was a weird kid. You were an amazing kid, and you became an amazing man." There was a pause. "You know I didn't always feel like one, especially last year." "I know, but I see you now, and you should see yourself too." He told me more about his sessions with Dr. Chen, the therapist, who helped him rebuild rather than erase. She'd encouraged him to reconnect with his father's side of the family too, an uncle in Michigan he hadn't spoken to in years. Grief had closed so many doors after Robert died, and Theo had begun to understand that closure wasn't the same as healing. "Dr. Chen said something interesting last week," he told me one afternoon while we planted hyacinths. "She said that sometimes, to grow up fully, we have to forgive our childhood, not because it was bad, but because we carried too much of it into adulthood like a second skin." I nodded slowly. "And have you?" "Some days, yes. Some days, I wear it like armor. And other days?" He looked up from the dirt. "Other days it feels like a seed, like something that's still growing." Word had spread around town about Theo's return. Mrs. Whitaker invited him to speak at the library, a homegrown success story, as she called it. He gave a talk about legal equity and public service, but afterward, in the Q&A, someone asked about me. "What was it like?" the man asked, being raised by the librarian. Theo's answer silenced the room. "It was like living with someone who believed in the power of stories, especially mine." The applause was warm, but I sat there stunned, grateful, trying not to cry into my tote bag. That winter snow fell early and thick. The garden lay buried, the soil asleep. Inside, however, life kept blooming. I turned 73 in January. Inez threw a party at the community center, just cake and punch and a slideshow of old photos. But it felt like a coronation. Theo gave a toast that made even the mayor tear up. "You were my first map," he said, glass in hand. "You taught me how to find my way back when I got lost, and no matter how far I wandered, You never let the trail grow cold. I hugged him afterward and whispered, "Even maps need to be updated sometimes." He smiled. This one holds. I began submitting essays to local journals, pieces drawn from the notebooks I'd once kept hidden. The Archive of Motherhood, I called them. A series of vignettes, reflections, even a few poems. They weren't flashy, but they were real, honest. And for the first time in my life, people read my words not as footnotes to my son's story, but as their own one piece. The cupboard where we kept the dinosaurs was picked up by a national publication. Inez practically fainted. Theo printed a copy and framed it for my office. "You're a writer now," he said. "I've always been a writer," I said. "I just didn't always believe my story was worth telling." In April, something extraordinary happened. A letter arrived in the mail. The handwriting was unfamiliar, elegant, professional. The return address was Boston. I nearly threw it away, thinking it was a catalog or fundraising request. But something made me open it. Inside was a single page. "Dear Mrs. Hartley, I've read your book, all of it, twice. I won't lie. I still don't understand the kind of love you gave. It scares me, honestly. It's louder, bigger, messier than anything I was raised with. But it's also beautiful. I made mistakes. In trying to protect Theo, I hurt him. And I hurt you. I can't undo that. But I wanted you to know that I see the story differently now. And I hope, wherever your journey leads, you keep writing. The world needs more mothers like you. Respectfully, Cassandra Avery. I read it 3 times before setting it down. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't moved, but because it wasn't about validation anymore. It was about closure. A door that, once slammed shut, was now quietly, delicately ajar. By summer, the garden was in full bloom again. This time, Theo helped me build something new. A memory garden, we called it. Not for grieving, but for honoring. We planted flowers for each chapter of his life. Bluebells for early childhood. Marigolds for the rough middle school years. Sunflowers for the golden summer he spent working at the library. We even buried a time capsule beneath the biggest rosebush. A collection of tokens, letters, and photos, meant for the day he'd eventually share his story with someone else. "Maybe with your child," I said. "Or maybe just with myself," he replied. "Either way, I want them to know where they came from." One evening in July, we sat on the back porch as fireflies lit up the dusk. Theo handed me a notebook, new, unmarked, its pages blank. "This one's for you," he said, "but not about me. Write the stories you've never told, the ones that came before I was born." I opened the cover, then looked up at him. "Are you sure you're ready for that?" "I want to know who you are when you're not my mother." I'd waited a long time to hear that sentence. Longer, perhaps, than I even realized. So I began. I wrote about Robert, about our courtship, our inside jokes, the way he'd hold my hand during sermons even when we disagreed with the preacher. About how he'd written me letters every day during his cancer treatments, each one starting with, "If I don't make it." I wrote about grief and how it doesn't feel like a storm but like fog, quiet, clinging, hard to explain to those who haven't walked through it. I wrote about being a librarian in a town that sometimes didn't care about books, about helping children find stories that mirrored their lives, about the girl who cried when she discovered Anne of Green Gables. Because she talks like I do, and I wrote about myself, not as a mother or a widow or a librarian, but as a woman who survived everything she thought might break her. As the year came full circle, I realized something I hadn't before. We think love is a contract, something you offer in exchange for security. But it's not. Love is an archive, a record of moments witnessed, feelings preserved, history remembered even when memory fades. Theo will live his life now, not as a man caught between past and present, but as someone who understands that both are essential. And I will live mine not as a woman waiting for a call, but as someone who answers her own. The violets on my windowsill still bloom each season. The cape is still tucked in the linen closet. Not because he needs it now, but because it reminds me that even the smallest acts of protection, of love, can last a lifetime. The book I wrote, the one that once felt like a lifeline, now sits on the shelf in Theo's apartment. Not as evidence in a trial, but as a sacred text, a story that needed to be told and was, not for revenge, not for reconciliation, but because love remembered is love honored, and honoring love, that's the legacy we leave. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.